Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this webinar organized by the Home Alliance on Geoengineering the Ocean is not a climate solution. I'm gonna very quickly, my name is Corina de la Plaza, and I'm gonna very quickly go through the housekeeping rules before giving the floor to the moderator and the speakers. Nikki, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so welcome. Just to let you know that there is interpretation available in Spanish and French. Use the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen with the world-shaped shape. And please be mindful with interpreters and try to speak slowly. Please mute your microphone when you are not speaking and turn off your camera if you think it affects your connection. You can always turn it on when or if speaking. And make yourself comfortable and enjoy the great webinar and the outstanding panel that we have today with us. And with this, I give the floor to Isha.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I am Isha, and I'm going to be moderating this webinar. This webinar is organized by the Hands of Mother Earth Alliance. Hands of Mother Earth Alliance, or the Home Alliance, is the driving force in the fight against the growing threat of large-scale technological manipulation of climate and biodiversity, also known as geoengineering. It is an international civil society network of close to 200 organizations from 45 different countries, from both the global south and the global north. In the recent years, there has been an increase in marine geoengineering projects and experiments. These projects involve various techniques such as ocean alkalinity enrichment, seaweed and biomass sinking, artificial upwelling, marine cloud brightening, and ocean surface albedo enrichment. Despite the differences in proposals and techniques, they all require a vast scale to have any impact on the climate, with carbon markets as a driving force. However, these projects present a significant amount of uncertainty and risk to the complex ocean environment, as well as to the communities and biodiversity that depend on them. In this webinar, we will be hearing from experts about the potential dangers of marine geoengineering. With the intersessional meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, this month, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, in June, we will learn about why these techniques are so risky, why it is crucial to uphold the de facto moratorium under the CBD, and how negotiations under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement could potentially legitimize these speculative and risky techniques. Additionally, we will hear about the essential steps that need to be taken to supplement the moratorium under the London Convention and the London Protocol. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today, and we are very grateful to them for joining us and making time for this webinar. First, we will be hearing from Dr. Lisa Levin, Distinguished Professor Emerita at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, University of California, San Diego. She is passionate about the deep sea and researches the ecology of different ecosystems in the deep ocean, the susceptibility to climate change, and human resource extraction, including mining. She is also the founder and co-lead of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, also known as DOSI, which aims to integrate science, technology, policy, law, and economics to provide advice on ecosystem-based management of resource use in the deep ocean. Thank you, Lisa, for being here, and I will give the floor to you now. Thank you.
Lisa, you are muted.
Okay, you can hear me now. I'm just trying to get into presentation mode. How does the slide look now?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I would like to, I can see now that I'm getting admit notices, but let me tell you a little bit about what I want to talk about over the next 15 minutes. I'm going to really introduce this concept of marine carbon dioxide removal, which is a series of different technologies that involve geoengineering the ocean. I'll talk about the motivation, the different types of technologies, and for each, the concerns we have about efficacy, equity, and environment. And then I'll close, if there's time, by talking about some of the governance challenges. Okay, so the motivation. I think many people realize that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been telling us now in a number of different reports and syntheses that in order to reach net zero emissions or net negative CO2 emissions and to achieve the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, that we are going to need to actively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I've listed here some of the special reports and terminology that they use. And these are from the last cycle, the AR6, but the new cycle that they've just started has considered carbon dioxide removal important enough that they've are developing a special meeting and methodology report on the technologies and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So as a result of this urgency to tackle the climate, we now have many, many different groups and sectors engaging in marine carbon dioxide removal. Let's see if I can advance here. So what is it? Well, most interventions in the past have been terrestrial, but people are now focusing on the ocean. And there are about 7 or 8 technologies designed to extract carbon from the atmosphere, and many of these involve depositing it into the deep ocean. If we look at the carbon cycle and this very technical diagram of where all the carbon sits on our planet, we find the deep ocean is the largest reservoir of carbon with 37,000 gigatons. It far exceeds the amount of carbon stored in the atmosphere or on land or in shallow water. And so it's not surprising that people are looking to the deep ocean as a new repository for carbon. And I'm going to talk about some of the different technologies that are proposing to use the deep ocean as basically a CO2 dumping ground. They are targeting deep waters because carbon stays out of the atmosphere for a very long time. This is a sequestration time map, and you can see that for carbon sequestered by natural processes, the biological pump, below 1,000 meters, it will stay out of the ocean in the Pacific for more than 100 years, sometimes up to 200 years, including in the Indian Ocean. But it does vary with ocean basin and water depth. Now, I want to show you a few schematics, and I'll talk in detail about each of the technologies. But I just want to point out that many of the schematics developed to describe marine carbon dioxide removal technologies depict the dumping ground, the deep ocean, as a flat, featureless, either black hole or brown line, as if there's nothing there. But of course, we know the deep ocean is not one ecosystem. It's not flat, featureless, or lifeless, as depicted in all the schematics. But the seafloor in the deep ocean, which is in fact most of the ocean, the area below 200 meters, it supports a whole slew of different ecosystems. I've shown many of them here. And each of these has its own biodiversity, often very high biodiversity. And these ecosystems support a host of many different services that we rely on to keep the planet healthy. And so while you watch this beautiful movie of seamounts off Costa Rica and the margin off Costa Rica, I'll just mention that some of those critical services involve climate regulation and storage of carbon and heat, nutrient regeneration, allowing the productivity of our oceans and all its fisheries, the provision of food to people. Biodiversity itself can be considered a service. But it also fuels genetic resources, which can lead to pharmaceuticals, industrial agents, and other products of benefit, biomimicry, developed products. The deep ocean has spiritual values. It's been important in science and education, and it's been inspiration for art and film and literature and much more. It's space we lay our cables. There are many other uses of the deep ocean. So the technologies that are proposed that would affect the deep ocean are many. It's important to point out that none of them have yet demonstrated efficacy in affecting and altering the carbon cycle and climate change. But they all, when deployed at scale, pose some environmental risk and unintended consequences. And they also raise equity concerns. I think we're at a point now where business interests and the race to sell carbon credits from these technologies have outpaced the science. We have a lot more science that needs to be done to even know about efficacy and safety. So I want to talk about what these are. The first group involves enhancing primary production and stimulating phytoplankton growth. This is a natural process. It's part of the biological pump. But if you add iron to the ocean or add nutrients in short supply, as can be done with artificial upwelling, because deep waters have more nutrients, this can stimulate phytoplankton growth and create algal blooms that then are designed to, intended to aggregate and sink into the deep ocean where the carbon's sequestered, or to feed plankton, which migrate down into deeper waters and help sequester the carbon. But there are many concerns here. This would have to be done on a very large scale. It's very difficult to verify the fate of carbon. We don't know how much is sequestered, how much is really exported to the deep sea versus recycled in waters or moved through circulation to other regions. There's concern about release of other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide and methane, or the zooplankton consuming and recycling the phytoplankton before it gets into deep waters. And there's really a lot of unknowns about the leakiness of deep carbon storage due to uncertainty about circulation. One of the big concerns about ocean fertilization, which has been studied more than a decade ago, is that beneath the blooms, it can form areas of low oxygen. We call this deoxygenation, and simultaneously, the decomposition while using up oxygen releases carbon dioxide and causes acidification. So the midwaters can be altered in ways that would affect ecosystems, the vertical migrations of animals, and the natural sequestration processes. Some past experiments have shown that there can be stimulation of harmful algal blooms, like cyanobacterial blooms, rather than the desired diatoms. And there's also concern that this causes depletion of nutrients and can amplify changes in biomass in other parts of the ocean. And, I think it's important to realize the ocean is highly connected. So what we do in one part of the ocean affects other parts. It's connected through thermohaline circulation, by physical processes, through the biological pump, through vertical migration and horizontal migrations of animals. So one modeling study by Tagliabue suggests that if we fertilize the Southern Ocean through iron fertilization, it will deplete nutrients in the top tropics in a way that leads to less productivity and lower fisheries biomass. And so all the countries' exclusive economic zones you see here in red, through a combination of both climate change and iron fertilization, would actually be losers in this game with potentially less fisheries production. Another group of technologies is macroalgal culture and sinking. The idea is that algae remove carbon dioxide from the water. This depletion allows the water to take up more carbon dioxide from the air. And then the algae is ultimately sunk, either with ballast or in bales. And there are, this would happen on a really, really large scale, massive algal culture in many cases in the open ocean. There are questions about net efficacy, and also that there aren't enough large areas with high enough nutrients to support algae and make a difference to the climate. It's very difficult to track the carbon in drifting kelp, so there are verification issues. There's concern that kelp will rob nutrients out of the water, so that the phytoplankton don't get it. And phytoplankton, of course, support different resources in many cases, food chains in many cases are fisheries. So we don't know if we replace phytoplankton with kelp, what the ultimate effect on the food web will be. There is concern about reduced efficacy by calcifiers living on the kelp. There's concern about changes to albedo, ocean albedo, and whether massive areas of kelp would reflect less sunlight and absorb more heat into the ocean. There are concerns about kelp drifting into other regions, biochemical changes as the kelp sinks, and impacts of those kelp farms on animal activity, on fishing activity, on animal migrations and shipping, and so on. And then once the kelp reaches the seafloor, it would smother basically what's down there if there's enough of it, cause anoxia, and could also release hydrogen sulfide, which is toxic, and methane and nitrous oxide, but in general would harm the biodiversity on the deep seafloor where it ends up. And many believe that there are other important uses for kelp rather than sinking it. A related technology is the deposition of terrestrial crop waste or a wood waste from land. That carbon would be baled and then sunk or compacted and then sunk into the deep sea where it would stay undegraded. Many people are targeting low oxygen zones, so degradation would be slower. There are concerns for crop and wood waste with loss of nutrients from terrestrial soils, exporting it into the deep ocean, and also the release of contaminants and pesticides that are used on land and bringing them into the deep ocean. And both the algae sinking and terrestrial biomass sinking, again, bring problems of anoxia, impacts on seafloor communities, and that there's limited space really to do this, especially if people are targeting anoxic basins. And then the final technology I want to mention is liquid CO2 injection. People are talking about putting it into the deep ocean, but most commonly subsurface into geological formations in the deep sea. And there are a number of concerns here. Also, if it goes into the water, we know CO2 is toxic to marine life, and it changes the pH. But there are also concerns about subsurface leakage. We've already seen that happening in some installations in Norway. And we don't know that much about the subsurface changes, but definitely if it leaks out into waters, it will affect deep marine ecosystems. Oh, that's not my last technique. I want to talk about ocean alkalinity enhancement. There are a couple of major methodologies for that: electrochemical processes, and then the increase of alkalinity through the addition of carbonates or silicates. And so even within these two technologies, there's many variations on the form, but the idea is to create a more alkaline ocean so that it takes up more CO2. It also helps to counter ocean acidification locally. But there are concerns because the particle enhancement that involves olivine and brucite involves massive amounts of terrestrial mining to get the crushed particles that would be put into the ocean, involves massive amounts of shipping. The particles can release toxic metals and create extra sedimentation onto the seabed, which can be harmful. The electrochemical methods split seawater into acidic and alkaline waters with sometimes the production of hydrogen, but it requires huge amounts of electricity and huge intakes of seawater, which in itself can actually kill the contents of the water, the plankton, fish larvae, and so on. But both really, we don't know much about the ecosystem level impacts or how the changes in pH to the water will affect organisms and ecosystems, and both are rather energy intensive and have high costs to scale up. So my points in sort of to summarize is that all of these technologies can affect the carbon services provided by the biological pump, by fish, mammals, and benthos. These services involve the removal, transport, transformation, sequestration, and burial of carbon naturally, but they're all highly sensitive and vulnerable to the ecosystem changes that can result from these different technologies that I've been talking about. So together, we find there are questions about both efficacy and feasibility of these techniques, and I really didn't have the time to go to those. There are environmental risks and impacts to the deep ocean. Most of these are in a research stage, but there is a very fine line between research and deployment, with many of the startups carrying these out interested and starting to sell carbon credits. There are equity issues. We find that geoengineering proponents often bypass national policies and regulations or co-opt local communities to execute their plans. And so often the applications will go to the global south or countries with more lax permitting. There's a complex legal landscape with calls to rewrite legislation to permit these technologies. A big concern is that none of the technologies actually solve the emissions problem, so it deflects us from the real, true urgency of emissions reductions. And the proponents really have upped the emergency level and the narrative, often reversing the precautionary principle through what we call climatism, which is declaring the climate emergency is so severe that we have to undertake risky actions and uncertain actions just to do something. It's led to some polarization of scientists, and I don't know, there are many issues, and I think they'll be discussed also through the rest of the webinar. But I do want to point out the complexity of the legal situation here. The UNFCCC is the one creating the mandate, the urgency for carbon dioxide removal. It's regulated by the London Convention and Protocol at the international level that regulates dumping into the ocean. The new biodiversity treaty in the high seas would potentially be able to weigh in through environmental impact assessment. The biodiversity, the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework has actually declared a moratoria on all forms of geoengineering in the past. There are a lot of different agencies that regulate the ocean that would probably want to weigh in on this, as any kind of many of these technologies would affect their activities, from mining to fishing to shipping. The scientists, of course, need to weigh in, and GASAMP has a working group on marine carbon dioxide removal, but the Decade for Ocean Science is also interested in this problem. And then finally, we need to look at how all of these activities would affect sustainable development goals and recognize that they have the potential to undermine Sustainable Development Goal 14, which involves the protection of the ocean. And I've gone on a long time. I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was a great presentation. We will be opening up the floor for questions. Lisa is on a time crunch, so please paste your questions in the chat, and I will be asking that to her. The first question that we got during your presentation was actually, what is thermohaline circulation?
Sometimes it's called the Great Conveyor Belt, but it's the natural ocean circulation that subducts waters from the high latitudes, both in the southern hemisphere and in the northern hemisphere, and brings it down and moves it subsurface down towards the equator. Takes about 1,000 years for ocean circulation to make its way from, say, the North Atlantic all the way into the North Pacific, but it happens. So the ocean is fully connected by this density-driven ocean water movements.
Thank you, Lisa. And the next question that we have is from David Hallows from South Africa. What is the impact of reduced marine animal life on the natural carbon cycle?
Well, it depends on where the animal life is, but we know that animals in the water are super important part of transfer of carbon from the surface where the phytoplankton fix it down into the deep sea. The largest migrations on Earth are the mesopelagic fish and crustaceans that bring carbon down. So certainly harming those midwaters through loss of oxygen or ocean acidification will affect the carbon cycle. And then animals on the seafloor also are responsible for sequestering carbon, both in their bodies through the production of calcium carbonate, for example, through cold water corals, and then for burial, the animals in sediments will move the carbon downward.
Thank you. And the next question we have is from Daniel. Do oceans have no capacity for self-regulation or self-regeneration?
They have a lot of capacity. They continually regenerate nutrients and cycle carbon. So I'm not sure I totally understand the question. I don't know that they have a capacity to combat human activities that put their the ocean cycles out of balance.
Sorry, just a minute. I'm trying to look at the chat. The next question is from Marlene from the Carbon Market Watch. You showed some concerns with the different methods. Would you say that one method presents more risk and dangers than the others?
I think it depends on scale and where. I think that the really large scale applications, because of the connectivity of the ocean, present more risk of affecting another place other than where it's applied. I've always thought that subsurface injection might actually be the safest, excuse me, for marine life if it doesn't leak out of the seafloor. But I've been reading about the model examples in Norway, and they all are having issues. And then we know once the CO2 leaks, that it can be problematic. So I honestly, I don't claim to be an expert in all of these technologies. I don't think I'm qualified. I think ocean alkalinity enhancement is probably the one which will have the least effect on the deep ocean because it's mostly applied coastally on beaches right now or in coastal waters. But, I honestly can't, advise one over another.
Our next question is from Andre. What do you think of the development of platforms for algal farming?
Well, based on what I've read, I think algal farming itself versus algal farming and sinking could have some benefits. Certainly, there are many valuable uses of algae while they take up CO2. It depends on what you do with that algae as to whether it will get recycled back into the atmosphere. But I am concerned about algal farms that cover hundreds and hundreds of square kilometers because there is no question they would interfere with animal migrations and other natural processes, as well as fishing activities and so on. I think algal farms are a great thing done in moderation and in balance, but I don't think they're going to solve the carbon problem or the climate problem, I should say.
Thank you, Lisa. I know you have to go. It's 8:30. So thank you for being here and thank you for the wonderful presentation. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody for listening.
Bye, Lisa.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so before we move on, I just want to remind everyone, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And also, keep the questions coming as we go through presentations. I am gonna go ahead and introduce our next speaker, which is David Santello, a scientist in Greenpeace's International Research Laboratory at Exeter University. He has almost 25 years of experience in environmental forensics, analysis, and the development of policies for environmental protection. He has represented Greenpeace in various international treaties and conventions related to the protection of the marine environment. Thank you, David, for being here, and I will hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, and hello to everyone on the call in the meeting. Will you be presenting the slides from your side, or shall I share my screen from here?
Yeah, we'll present the slides from our side. Just let us know when you want to switch them out.
Okay, so if we could go to the first slide then, please. So I'm going to pick up, it was almost like we planned it from one of Lisa's final slides, where she was looking at the regulatory environment for marine geoengineering. And Lisa mentioned the work of the London Convention and London Protocol, and she also mentioned the work of the UN group of experts, GISAMP. And what I'll be talking about is the work that's been done over the last 15 years or so in those two bodies. So the London Convention, London Protocol, essentially conventions that were designed initially to address primarily the dumping of wastes at sea, also cover the introduction of other matter, so any material that's put into the ocean that could have an adverse effect on marine ecosystems. And that's why it was the most relevant place to try to address also aspects relating to carbon storage and marine geoengineering. There is a page within the London Protocol website that explains some of the history, and there is access to a number of the different documents available through there. But if you get a copy of my presentation afterwards, you'll also see that there are many links within the presentation. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So this was mentioned, as I said, GISAMP, the UN group of experts, has a working group looking at marine geoengineering activities. And you'll notice as I go through the slides that I've borrowed from that very useful graphic that they have here, because I think it provides a way of stepping through the different decisions that have been taken so far within the framework of the London Convention and Protocol. So next slide, please. Lisa mentioned about the disposal of carbon dioxide streams in sub-seabed stores, reservoirs, and that is something about which I share a lot of her concerns. It is something that has been enabled through the work of the London Protocol, but has to be done in a very specific way. So it's not as if it's an unregulated activity. It should be a very carefully regulated activity, and one that relies upon the right site selection and also on monitoring going forward. We're concerned that that having this as an option is going to make it more difficult to move away from fossil fuels. So we're trying to see whether this can be restricted to hard to abate sectors where you're dealing with CO2 from those. And we also feel there is a need to look in much more detail at the monitoring and the verification that the CO2 is actually staying where it's put. But I'm not going to talk more about subseabed CCS at this point, where the carbon dioxide is isolated. If we go on to the next slide. As part of the discussion, there was also talk of putting carbon dioxide into the water or onto the seabed, or perhaps even into shallow sediments. And that is something which is not permitted. So carbon capture and storage under the London Protocol has to be in subsea geological reservoirs. It cannot be into the water column or onto the seabed or into shallow sediments. And that exclusion is more explicit in some of the regional seas conventions that have picked up this kind of activity. But what I want to talk about more are some of those techniques that fall perhaps more clearly into the realms of marine geoengineering. So manipulating natural systems in order to try to increase the drawdown of CO2 or change ocean chemistry. And this is something about which we've been concerned for well over 2 decades, but it was in 2007 that concerns were heightened also at the international policy level, because there were a number of companies coming forward wanting to do ocean fertilization, either by adding nutrients or by creating upwelling in order to sell carbon offsets, so as a commercial proposal. And I think that although at that stage there was already a lot of concern in the scientific community about the impacts that ocean fertilization could have, the commercial aspect to this really focused the minds of the regulators, the policymakers, to take a fresh look at this. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the history here of the way in which the London Convention and London Protocol have addressed, firstly, ocean fertilization, and then moving on to other marine geoengineering techniques. So in spring 2007, there was a statement of concern issued from the scientific advisory groups that advise the governing bodies of the LC and LP. That was endorsed by the parties themselves in the autumn of the same year, so it's quite a swift recognition of the problem. And then just 1 year later, there was a resolution that essentially prohibited all ocean fertilization activities other than what is termed legitimate scientific research. So there was a recognition that there were some activities that would be required to be used for scientific research that involved the introduction of nutrients to the ocean. And the idea was to prohibit everything else, but to provide a way in which those kinds of activities could be assessed and regulated. The difficulty then, that's it, thank you. The difficulty then is in determining what is legitimate scientific research. And that took another 2 years to define an assessment framework, which was used to make that determination. And that has pre-screening criteria designed to remove some of the activities that clearly wouldn't fall under that category, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And then a very detailed assessment framework looking at the environmental impacts to make sure that that experimental work is not going to have significant adverse effects on the marine environment. Now, those 2 resolutions, the one from 2008 and 2010, remain in force. They apply to all London Convention and London Protocol parties, so that's about just over 100 countries. But there is also moves to bring the effect of those resolutions into legal force through an amendment to the London Protocol, which was agreed now 10 years ago in the autumn of 2013. And that extended the concern not just to ocean fertilization, but also to allow expansion to address other marine geoengineering activities in the future. And that's the stage that we're now moving on to. The resolutions remain in place for ocean fertilization, and the efforts are continuing to develop regulation for those other marine geoengineering techniques. Next slide, please. I mentioned the pre-screening criteria for legitimate scientific research. They relate to having a very specific purpose, scientific purpose. They relate to being subject to peer review and also making a commitment to publish the results. But perhaps one of the more significant ones here is also point 2, that economic interests should not influence the design, conduct and or outcomes of the proposed activity. And there should be not be any financial or economic gain arising directly from the experiment or its outcomes. What that means is that if you are selling carbon credits based on your experiment having a certain outcome, so based on calculation of how much carbon you're absorbing, that is not legitimate scientific research, because you're biasing the outcome of your experiment by selling carbon credits or offsets on the basis of what you expect to happen. So that's something which is important in the pre-screening criteria. It doesn't prevent people from doing legitimate scientific research, but it does provide a barrier against the commercialization of that research in order to sell offsets. Next slide, please. So we have those resolutions from 2008, 2010, and the one adopting the amendment to the London Protocol, which is yet to enter into force. And if we have the next slide, what the parties to the London Convention and Protocol have now gone on to do is to look at those other marine geoengineering activities. And Lisa, I think, spoke of many of those: alkalinity enhancement, macroalgae cultivation and sinking, or placement of other biomass, and increasing reflectivity either of the ocean surface or marine cloud brightening. And those have been going through both a legal and a scientific consideration. And if we go to the next slide, please. You'll see that in October 2022, the governing bodies of the LC and LP identified the need for careful evaluation of 4 of those techniques. 2 of them carbon dioxide removal, 2 of them solar radiation modification, and passed that work then to the scientific groups, the scientific advisory body, which then met in March 2023 and concluded that all 4 of those have the potential to cause pollution. So to have the potential to cause deleterious effects that are widespread, long-lasting, or severe. And it depends, of course, on how they're done. But those are the techniques: the alkalinity enhancement, biomass cultivation for sinking, marine cloud brightening, and surface albedo enhancement. And then following that, in the autumn of last year, you can go to the next slide, please. The governing bodies endorsed the scientific concerns and gave the first policy steer on those other marine geoengineering activities, in stating that such marine geoengineering activities, other than legitimate scientific research, should be deferred. So this is not a statement that they're not considering some change in policy in the future, but for the time being, recognizing the concerns and the uncertainties, the feeling is that those other 4 geoengineering techniques should also be limited just to legitimate scientific research. And that's something which is now ongoing with a technical discussion just earlier this year, and will come back for a policy discussion again in the autumn of 2024. And then if we just go to the final slide, just 2 recent updates. So at the UNEA 6 meeting, there was direct reference made in one of the resolutions, resolution 15, to the need to ratify, accept, approve, or accede to the 1996 protocol to the London Convention. And that's in part because of the fact that it includes this legal obligation to address ocean fertilization and marine geoengineering, rather than relying on resolutions. So that's partly the rationale behind bringing that forward. And then in April this year, as I've said, we had the scientific groups meeting, and they looked at refining and updating the definitions of those 4 marine geoengineering techniques. So those are draft definitions. They have to go forward to the governing bodies in the autumn for consideration and agreement, but it's, again, further progress that's been made. So I hope that's given an overview of where things stand. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So we will be opening the floor for questions. There have already been some questions. So the first question that popped up is from Simon. Would enhanced oil or gas recovery be accounted for regarding economic gain in experimentation in spent oil and gas reservoirs?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Well, enhanced oil recovery is actually something that's normally regulated entirely separately, either from marine geoengineering or from subsea bed carbon capture and storage. So it's dealt with on a national basis rather than on an international basis, or perhaps on a regional one in the case of the European system. But it is dealt with separately because it is an enhanced oil recovery activity rather than considered to be a disposal option that's regulated under the carbon capture and storage rules. I think you raise a good point, though, because when there have been a lot of promises made about carbon capture and storage and its role in decarbonizing. Whereas in fact, if you look at the most recent statistics from the Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, the Global CCS Institute, you'll see that still more than 2/3 of the carbon capture and storage activities ongoing are for enhanced oil recovery. So they're actually for getting more hydrocarbons out of the ground and not as part of a solution to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. That may change in the future, but it's been very slow to change so far.
Thank you. Another question that we had is, what does geoengineering actually mean? Is it just like a coin term, or is it actually a scientific term?
I think it is increasingly recognized as a scientific term. It has a broad definition within the London Convention and Protocol. It is basically any human activity that's designed to manipulate natural systems in order to counteract the effects of climate change or ocean acidification. And that's necessarily broad because it has to cover all of those different technologies that try and address the problem in very different ways, all with unknown efficacy, of course. That's the other issue. But that's the reason why it's so important to have these scientific discussions within this policymaking forum, is to come up with definitions that are inclusive enough to address the issue, but don't inadvertently capture other activities. So one example of that would be the definition for ocean fertilization includes an explicit exclusion for conventional aquaculture and conventional mariculture. So it makes it clear that it's not trying to capture that. And that's, I think, one of the examples of how difficult it can be to get to these definitions, but how important it is nonetheless that it's very clearly defined what is covered and what is not.
Thank you. And the next question we have is from Barbara. I'm interested to hear more about the amendments made to the London Protocol. What are the effects of these amendments to the current developments in geoengineering?
Well, with the resolutions themselves address at the moment only ocean fertilization, but they do provide a framework for assessment of any activity, whether that's adding nutrients or causing upwelling or downwelling, anything that is involved in boosting productivity. There is an assessment framework that should be applied, and that is independent of the entry into force of any change to the legal text of the convention or protocol. And that should mean that many of the proposals coming forwards could be assessed properly and either allowed as a legitimate scientific research experiment or prevented from happening through not issuing a permit or actually preventing something more actively. The ultimate aim is to have the same kind of approach for all of those other marine geoengineering activities, the alkalinity enhancement, the biomass sinking, etc. It's not there yet, but I think what the parties to the London Convention and Protocol have done is said very clearly that they are approaching the same policy direction. So if you want to do legitimate scientific research, you apply an assessment framework, you apply for a permit to do that, and everything else at the moment is off limits. And that's recognizing the risks of doing these kinds of experiments in an uncontrolled way, especially if you are already selling your hypothesis in the way of claiming carbon credits.
Thank you. And the next question is, I read about an experiment to create sea ice in the Arctic. Would that fall under geoengineering according to the London Convention?
It would fall under geoengineering. I think it's still an open question as to whether it's an activity that could be captured under the legal provisions of the London Convention and Protocol. I think that's something which will be discussed in more detail. And it's an important question in a way, because we have to remember that although the London Convention and Protocol provide a mechanism to regulate marine geoengineering activities and to regulate geoengineering activities in the marine environment, essentially, it's not going to provide all of the solutions. There may be some activities that are not deemed to fall sufficiently well within the legal provisions to be able to be addressed fully and comprehensively within that. It may be that there is a need for other bodies to supplement and to bring in their own additional regulations in order to make sure that all of these things are captured and there are no techniques that could be damaging that are slipping between the gaps in a way. So I think what we have been able to do through the London Convention and Protocol has been very positive, but it's not the only game in town.
David, there was a question regarding one of your slides. Can you explain the meaning of the different colors of the circles enveloping the different technologies?
Yes, so a red circle just means that there's some regulation. An orange circle means that there's some consideration. So that's why the difference is there between the ocean fertilization, where you have those very clear resolutions, and you have the development of the or the agreement of the legal text. That's why they were in a red circle, and the ones in the orange circle are the ones that are currently under consideration for the most appropriate governance.
I'm gonna give you two more questions. So there's one about the sinking of biomass off Iceland to sell carbon credits. So is there anything being done about this, or could something be done about this, or are they trying to squeeze this in before the London Convention and the London Protocol expands on their moratorium? So that's the first question. And the next question is that, can we measure the natural carbon capture and storage of the ocean itself? And can we enhance to protect these systems that do so naturally?
Okay, I'll take the second question first. And the answer to that is yes, within margins of error, you can estimate and measure natural carbon uptake and storage within marine systems. And we feel that there is a very strong argument to be made through the protection of marine ecosystems that store carbon, allowing them to recover through the designation of protected areas, for example, addressing human activities that impact on those ecosystems, to allow them to recover and build up those greater stores of carbon. I think that has to be part of the process going forwards. It's one of the rationales beyond the protection of biodiversity for the setting aside of 30% of the oceans as fully protected marine reserves. To come back to the first question, sorry, could you remind me the first question again?
David, I think in the interest of time, we might need to move on to the next panelist. But if you can quickly answer the question, since I brought it up, is that it's talking about the sinking of biomass off of Iceland.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes, I can answer that very quickly. So that was not done under an environmental permit. It was an agreement with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a decision that has raised a lot of concern amongst other parties, other countries. Iceland has yet to explain in full how it made that decision, but yes, very, very concerned about that, given the scale and the fact that that is being sold as carbon credits.
Thank you, David. For rest of the questions, please keep them coming. And if they aren't answered right now, we'll make sure that they're answered. We will be noting down your questions. Okay, so let's move on to our next panelist. Next, we will be hearing from Panganga Pangowi from the Indigenous Environment Network. They, them, she, her is an indigenous mother from Swangog, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, located in the so-called Bering Strait. Panganga has been involved in many grassroots efforts seeking justice for indigenous people, including efforts to protect lands and waters from the extractive industry. Social justice and healing are recurring themes woven into Panganga's personal and professional life. Healing, justice, and advocacy continues in Panganga's roles at the IEN as a climate geoengineering organizer. Thank you, Panganga, for being here, and I will give the floor to you now.
Thank you. Wanga atka bangangang ng nakabangawi, wanga ataka agnaterma naka Kirsten Nugak Pass. So I come from Savunga, that's how you pronounce it. And I wanted to give a little bit of history about my island, and I'll give a few words before I jump into this very rough, just highlights of some data collection we've been doing around Indigenous communities in Alaska. So St. Lawrence Island is between Alaska and Russia. It's in the subarctic, but we rely heavily on the Arctic. And you know, the first time we had a wave of genocide was during the European whalers when they came in the late 1800s, and they decimated the whale population. They wanted to use the whales for oil and for baleen. And so when the marine ecosystem collapsed, basically when the whales died, our community died. This happened at the same time that Krakatoa erupted. It caused a plume so great that there were 2 years of straight winter in Alaska. So there was a mass starvation. So we also experienced a lot of hardship and toxicity when the military came in and built a base on Northeast Cape, the Northeast Cape of our island. When they didn't want the base usable anymore, they asked the soldiers to take a backpack, cut the lines, and leave. And so what that meant was they spilt barrels and barrels of oil, heavy metal solvents, and other toxins on our land, which seeped into the tundra and has leaked into the ecosystem and, of course, the food chain. And so we do have a very high rate of cancer on our island, and we continue to do so to this day. That happened just after the Cold War. We also, in Alaska, have a history of radioactive iodine injections where the military injected people to see if iodine would allow soldiers to survive longer in the cold, and they used Indigenous bodies to do so. And so we come from a long history of having been used as both the stepping stool and the dumping grounds of Western society, and from the military as well as the science community. And so that's the history that I carry with me. And I also carry the resilience of the people who have survived that and have continued to fight, people like Annie Aloha, who pointed out the high rate of cancer and fought and advocated until something was done about it. And so I always remember her when I'm doing these presentations as well. I'm just going to kind of jump in here, not into the slide yet. So apart from the debate about these technologies that simply try to focus on any potential pros and cons of each technology, each of these has several underlying common themes. They are billionaire and fossil fuel backed, they are theoretical and risky, and they would cost enormous amounts of resources and would require multi-decade international agreements. They required the continued use of Indigenous lands, waters as sacrifice zones, as we have seen in resource development that have gotten us into the climate crisis to begin with. Already these technologies are being tested on us without our free, prior, and informed consent. As an Indigenous person deeply tied to the land, I must emphasize that the peril of excluding Indigenous perspectives while devising solutions to address climate change is detrimental. Our close relationship with the ecosystems being experimented on is integral to our understanding of their intricate balance and delicate harmony. Those conducting these experiments often lacked familiarity with our ecosystems, and their methods of testing and inquiry fall short of comprehensiveness. Their questions are often one-dimensional, failing to consider the necessity for nature to have time to adapt to a rapidly changing climate. Further human intervention through geoengineering would disrupt the natural adaptive process of these ecosystems. The urgency of the climate crisis demands that we consider the long-term consequences of our actions. It is essential to recognize that the wisdom embedded in Indigenous knowledge systems is rooted in the deep observation and understanding of our environment over generations. Our traditional Indigenous knowledge offers insight into the resilience and adaptability of the ecosystems, emphasizing the need for a cautious and holistic approach to environmental stewardship. We are in a climate crisis because of a flawed value system that allows for the sacrifice of many and the supposed benefit of a few. Geoengineering in concept continues that practice. Resource development and geoengineering are also forms of commodifications of nature and wrongly views humans as separate from nature. Our communities intimately tied to the land, water, bear witness to the interconnectedness of all life and the necessity of preserving the integrity of our ecosystems. In light of these considerations, it's imperative that decision makers and researchers engage in genuine dialogue with Indigenous peoples, recognizing invaluable wisdom we possess. Our voices hold the key to a more comprehensive understanding of the complex web of relationships within ecosystems and the consequences of large-scale interventions. In addition to the above, because we live in a world that overlooks the rights of Indigenous peoples, we have already seen projects ignore free, prior, and informed consent ethics, as do we see a drastic increase of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives with any large-scale project deployment on or near our Indigenous territories. Geoengineering technologies and carbon markets are forms of green colonialism, which continues the land and ocean grab that has begun since colonization. These concepts separate Indigenous peoples from the lands, waters, and air from the very ecosystems we are a part of. Our interaction and direct relationship with these ecosystems is what has protected over 80% of Earth's biodiversity. Removing our voices, our relationship, is not only disrespectful and in violation of the sacred, but it is also dangerous to those very ecosystems. So with that, I'm gonna jump right in. So you wanna go to the next slide, Nikki? Thank you. So these are just some highlights of interviews and focus groups that we've conducted with a local evaluator who made sure that I didn't taint the data when we presented different geoengineering projects to communities and let them know what their intended use was, and then kind of asked them point blank what they thought about it. And you can go to the next slide. These are just some of the communities that we. So these are some highlights from just the conversations around these two projects, and a little bit about our conversation around free, prior, and informed consent. So we talked about Arctic Ice Project, which proposes to cover the Arctic ice over 100,000 square kilometers with silica hollow glass microspheres. And we talked about the Real Ice Project, which is an experiment that was deployed in Nome, which proposes to cover about 10% of the Arctic, I think, with, I have to go back and look at their website, with green hydrogen fueled ice pumps, which would suck water from underneath the ice and spill it over the top. Both of these projects, their goal is to thicken the ice. So both of these pose some serious but unknown consequences in the Arctic environment. Large scale testing and deployment of these geoengineering. Oh, yes. So they have already started doing testing, one in Utqiagvik, where they're covering football fields worth of silica without talking to the tribes, and the other where they actually deployed one ice pump without having spoken to any tribes around the Nome area in Alaska. So in free, prior, and informed consent, they have not followed any of those policies from UNDRIP, and Indigenous peoples should be able to provide or withhold or withdraw consent at any point regarding projects impacting their territories. And it also states that they should be engaging in negotiations to shape the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of projects. Neither of those have been followed. Next slide. So we wanted to learn more about the regional Indigenous response to projects. We had some questions that were created by local evaluators. We kind of reviewed and modified those to make them more relevant to the local community. We interviewed and had focus groups with affected populations, mostly Indigenous people, subsistence hunters. We also spoke to some local government officials and Arctic researchers. And these are researchers who have been working in the Arctic with Indigenous communities for decades. And we've synthesized some of those, and we're in the process of reviewing that synthesis. Next slide. So the one of the impressions was there's little or no local awareness of climate change intervention projects for both the Arctic Ice and Real Ice project. The locals were not aware that those experiments had even happened. They were neither informed nor consulted, neither were they asked consent, both as people just of the community as well as the tribes themselves. There's also a clear sense that geoengineering sponsors don't respect traditional knowledge. Let's see, you can kind of read there some of the concepts that were harvested from our interviews and our focus groups. One of my favorite quotes, we have this Indigenous knowledge system of the ocean. There are repercussions that we can't account for. We would make decisions about how safe the ice is, what kinds of animals go for and when, based on what we've been taught for generations and generations, which may make the ocean unsafe for us without knowing that this is happening. This could be devastating. So in this instance, we talked about the method that the ice thickens matters, and makes it safe or unsafe for people to walk on. So if you're going to be pumping water from underneath the ice and spilling it over the top, or you're going to be artificially thickening it without the freeze melt cycle by sprinkling some silica on the top, you are potentially causing very brittle ice that people are unaware of and could fall through. So there's a lot of safety concern with these types of projects. Next slide. So there is an impression that community consultation and traditional knowledge are essential. And local communities were concerned that there was very little awareness of the opportunity to collaborate with interested and affected community members. They also felt like free, prior, and informed consent, even if that was followed, kind of puts natives on the defensive and puts Indigenous peoples on the defensive. The assumption is that projects happen outside of us. They don't come from us. They're not developed by us. They happen to us from the outside. And this is just a form of defense for us. And there was a lot of discussion around how resources could be given to local communities, Indigenous communities, in order to develop their own solutions to then implement, rather than outside researchers coming in, even to consult and to gain free, prior, and informed consent, puts us on the defensive. Traditional knowledge is essential in conducting research in the Arctic. There was a widespread awareness that traditional knowledge would better inform the projects that were being proposed, or would even steer people away from proposing such projects to begin with. Next slide. There was a lot of concern around the integrity of the food chain being threatened by both of these particular projects. A food security researcher was very concerned about the extent to which silica could infiltrate the food chain and find its way into human bodies. And then the impacts of silica entering the food chain are unknown. So Arctic Ice Project has done some experiments in terms of short-term toxicity or short-term ingestion toxicity. And they've done things like expose the embryos of some fish and some birds to claim that the material is safe. But to deploy this at such a large scale, at 100,000 square kilometers per year, and and thrown that into the food chain. That's a completely different, you can't really account for that using those methods. That's very inadequate. There was concerns about malnutrition of animals, having mistaken the microspheres themselves for food. There's a lot of concern about the life system within the ice. So the algae that grows underneath the ice, needing sunlight to permeate that ice, the freeze and melt cycle of the ice that is essential for the life system within it. And also blue cod, we were talking about, lay their eggs underneath the ice as well. So putting ice pumps on top of ice and sucking water from underneath would disrupt that process as well. So there are a lot of things that are not being considered that would be considered if people just talk to the indigenous peoples who reside within those ecosystems. Next slide. So there is not a great history with geoengineering research projects consulting with Alaska Native people. People are not always notified, and if there are any people notified, it's very few. There aren't very many adequate publication methods. So even if something does come out, there's nothing that's translated into the local languages. And there's nothing that follows local protocol for disseminating knowledge and disseminating information. Residents are not always treated well by researchers. Let me see. Yeah, so there's like a lot of criticism when it was brought up that they should run these projects by the tribes. So one of the things one of the researchers team had said was, we're doing a small scope pilot project. That seems like a lot of work to do before a pilot project. Don't they know about climate change? Don't they want to do something? So there's a lot of resistance peoples from the teams themselves, we've noticed. Both talked about one tactic that projects I'm getting interrupted. So one of the tactics was so folks are not given adequate time. You can go to the next slide. I know I'm taking up too much time. So we have very different cosmovision, and don't integrate philosophies very well. We're not given the opportunity to inform or speak on these things. Go to the next one. And I'm just going to kind of let you guys skim through these because it's already, I'm taking up all the time and Mary's not going to have any time to, to do her presentation. I'm so sorry. Yeah, this is it.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, it's Sylvia. Sorry, Sylvia.
Panganga, did you want to go through the takeaways, or are we ready to move on?
I think we should just move on. I mean, folks can take a screenshot and I can answer questions later.
Okay, thank you, Panganga. We are now moving on to our next speaker for today. Don't worry, we will have time in the end to ask Panganga and Sylvia more questions. So please stick around if you have any questions. So I would like to introduce Sylvia Ribeiro. She is the Latin America Director for the ETC Group. The ETC Group was the first civil society organization to raise awareness about geoengineering and its possible consequences. As a civil society representative, Sylvia has taken part in all the geoengineering negotiations at the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, and various other UN organizations. I'm very excited to hear from you, and I will hand over the floor to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Isha. I would like to thank you to everybody, and I think that Panganga was doing really important points. So maybe at the end we can go to the takeaways of Panganga again. I would like to share my screen, but thank you. Uh-oh, sorry. Is that okay?
That's good.
Thank you. So I will try to be shorter, so see if some things has already been said and others, I will try to make it so we have short, so we have some time at the end. And well, just to repeat that the issue of geoengineering is about technological interventions that are at very large scale. So this, and that they are intentional. This is like the three main characters that define what is geoengineering. And sometimes it's really important to remember this, because many of the proponents of geoengineering, they put a small example like a ship here or some algae deployment here, but to really have any impact on climate change, it will have to be really huge, and that will also have huge impacts. And I also would like to remember that none, absolutely none of the geoengineering techniques aim to address the causes of climate change. They only aim to partially counteract some symptoms. For instance, to try to lower the temperature or to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but the drivers of climate change and biodiversity erosion, they will continue. So what geoengineering and all these techniques that we have seen is doing is creating a captive market, because climate change will continue. So they are not solving anything. They are creating a new market. So CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, had a very early discussion on geoengineering, first on ocean fertilization from 2007, along with the London Convention, and then generally. And CBD in 2010 had a decision about asking all the parties of CBD, which is 196, to not have any climate geoengineering activities that affect biodiversity to take place until a series of conditions were met. And these conditions are not of documents, a set of scientific documents that are online. And these documents are not, they were produced before this discussion in 2012 and later. And the issue is that they are not only scientific, hundreds and even thousands of comments of different parties, different members of CBD. There have also been other reports in the United Nations, like for instance, the last year, as Convention and the London Protocol. The Human Rights Council basically states that geoengineering has a vast potential to violate human rights if deployed. And we have also been hearing Panganga before, how most or I think all of the experiments on geoengineering, both solar and marine, hasn't on indigenous and not preceded by any consultation. Third, the list of potential marine geoengineering technologies, or technologies that are solar geoengineering but that affect marine systems. And basically what we can take, the takeaway from both the presentation was that there are multiple potential impacts of marine ecosystems. And some of them are related to the disruption of marine food chain. But they create turbidity and contamination, both chemical and organic contamination. They create shadows over the seas in large areas, and they reduce light and the flows of gases and also oxygen. They change the temperature. They promote the growing of toxic algae. And also these large-scale algae plantations produce the contamination of pathogens to natural vegetation. And a set of other impacts that are related to that. Basically, what we can say is that there are a lot of uncertainties, both on how the marine system functions, but also on the impacts they could have. For instance, this pretty unpredictable, the impacts on the carbon cycle because of the dynamic system. It could be, in many cases, that they release even more greenhouse gases that they are supposed to be sequestering or taking. And there are also many unpredictable systems impacts on biodiversity because of the cascade reactions on complex. I'm sorry for my Spanish. I will try to repeat this in English. I'm sorry also for the interpreters. Okay, so there will be unpredictable impacts on biodiversity because of the reactions in very complex systems that are not sufficiently known. There will also be a lot of other sets of impacts, like the impacts derived of the infrastructure. And of course, like Panganga mentioned and other mentions, a lot of impacts on coastal communities and on traditional livelihoods. We have in ETC Group, we produced this report called the Seaweed Deletion, where we go through the promises that, these very large promises. There is a lot of hype around algae and seaweed production, but in reality, none of this is really demonstrated. Besides the many new impacts that they introduce, some of which I already mentioned, like creating shadow, produce lack of oxygen, but they also deviate nutrients and they rob nutrients and space for natural ecosystems that are very, very important. And they also spread pathogens from these monocultures of algae and so. But also they retain very little carbon. There are even studies that say that these kind of artificial plantations on the sea, they can even be a carbon emitter. So it's very important to remember that none of these areas, nowhere, none in Arctic, nowhere else, they are not empty. They are fragile, threatened ecosystems, and there are a lot of communities that are also living and managing them today in a sustainable way. So this could be not only algae, but the marine geoengineering technologies is basically could unbalance a system that is already very fragile and vital. So carbon markets are really fueling this because before carbon markets in UMCCC, there was not this enormous hype. The voluntary markets are already selling carbon credits of technologies that cannot by no means be sure that they are neither sequestering carbon in, and there is no proof of permanence because of the dynamics of the sea. So it is extremely important that the UMCCC wouldn't allow any way of marine geoengineering before all these uncertainties are really cleared, and they are not. So the CBD had a series of decisions that are compiled in one special place in the CBD. So you can go to this and see the text and the documents that the Convention on Biological Diversity has produced. The first decision was about ocean fertilization, and basically request all the parties and urge the parties that are not that are not members of CBD to not allow any ocean fertilizations activities. This is still in place because none of the conditions has been met. And the issue also here is that they specifically ask to not that any ocean fertilization should not be used for generating and selling carbon offsets or any other commercial purposes. And the reason for this is that once this waste is out, this will really promote a lot of deployment of these technologies that could have combined impacts on the marine ecosystems and others ecosystems. Then in 2010, the CBD took a much broader decision on all kinds of geoengineering. They only accepted carbon capture and storage from fossil fuels, but all the others, including BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and all marine technologies are included. And this is still in force. And this is asking all parties to not deploy any of these technologies until there is a scientific, transparent global mechanism for regulation, but also that it has to be consideration for socioeconomic, cultural aspects, and also, even if there are exceptions for a small scale scientific studies, they are asked to have consultation, free, prior, and informed consent, and also be sure that they don't have transboundary impacts and that they are subject to prior impact assessment. I mentioned these different parts of this decision because, for instance, all the experiments that has been attempted in indigenous territories or even in local communities territories hasn't complied with this requirement. So even if they can say it is small scale, they are in violation of these decisions of CBD. So there are actually more than 40 projected or ongoing geoengineering experiments, particularly on these technologies that the London Convention is analyzing. And there is no compliance with CBD or with existing London Convention decisions. They have been done and they are planned without free, prior, and informed concerns. So CBD really needs to affirm the precautionary principle and recall and ensure implementation of its decision on geoengineering. I want to mention really quickly that there are, for instance, members of the London Convention and CBD, like the UK, like Australia, that are planning a lot of different experiments, and these are in clear violation to the decisions that CBD has taken. So one of them is about ocean fertilization. Other from Australia and the Australian government and universities is about marine cloud brightening. And all of these are in violation of almost every of the elements that I mentioned in these decisions. So what should CBD do now? And this is important because CBD is going to have a meeting next week in Nairobi at UNEP of their scientific body, the SBSTA of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they will be discussing marine geoengineering. CBD really needs to reaffirm precaution to protect marine and coastal biodiversity and traditional livelihoods. And one immediate way of doing this is recalling and affirming decision 1033 on geoengineering, but also taking into account, recognizing and taking into account the work of the London Convention and the London Protocol and taking it to discussion into the CBD when the results come from there. And also remind the parties that they have to report to CBD on any projects that they are taken. So these could be things that can be discussed now next week in SBSTA. What we need on biodiversity, climate change, marine ecosystems is that recognize that those situations are so urgent, so we cannot waste time on all these speculative technologies that will also bring a new set of impacts. So I will just say that there is a lot more information on what I mentioned, and many of the documents that the Home Alliance has produced, and ETC and others, can be found at the Geoengineering Monitor. You can see, and you will get the link later. There is also a really useful interactive map of geoengineering projects where you can go and look in your area, in the different techniques and where these both research and experiments are planned. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. We are going to be opening up the floors for any questions for both Sylvia and Panganga. So please put your questions in the chat. There was a couple of questions earlier. Perhaps Sylvia or Panganga can answer this. So the question was, is geoengineering a sustainable solution? What is the cost of geoengineering for developing countries? And who really benefits from geoengineering?
Well, I can say I would say rapidly, but I suddenly remembered about the translation. So geoengineering, as I said in the beginning, is a technological proposal that has historically always come from very few countries. And these are the same northern countries that has caused climate change. So 2/3 of climate change is caused by around 10 countries, and those are the countries promoting geoengineering. And the reason for that is that they have a lot to win on that, because in that sense, they have most of the profits, so to say, from climate change has been benefiting these regions, and now they are creating new technologies that will create new markets without having to change what they have caused before. So this is the logic of geoengineering, and this is the logic that repeats one time again all the time. So that is what I would say on that, on who benefits and who produces.
Thank you. If there are any more questions,
Bonjour,
please.
est-ce que je peux vous poser une question, s'il vous plaît?
Could I ask for a question, please? Could I pose a question, please?
Put in the chat, and our translators will do the best to ask the question. So please put it in the chat. Yeah, I know we're at time, but we are going to be here for a few more minutes, holding the floor for any more questions. Otherwise, we will be wrapping up quickly. Thank you to all the speakers for being here. I'm just going to give it a minute to see if any questions pop up. Ahmed, if you wanted to ask your question in French, and if someone would be happy to translate for your question, we'll be happy to answer it. Please go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Ok, donc je vous remercie d'abord d'avoir nous.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. I'm glad to be here. It's really important, and it's themes that we really are concerned about. So my question is the following. I would like to know about the environmental impacts. Is there a possibility to have projects that could be financed by your organization for some projects for the people, on the fields? Could you hear?
Sorry, we are just trying to figure this out. So the question basically is asking about the environmental impact for people on ground. Can you try and address that question, either Sylvia or Panganga, if you can speak to that?
I think it has been so many examples of environmental impacts. So maybe just looking through these presentations, you will have a lot. But there are many, many potential impacts of geoengineering, of all kinds of geoengineering, marine geoengineering, terrestrial or solar geoengineering, depending on the techniques. But maybe some of them are common. And if you go to the Hands of Mother Earth land page and see the manifesto, you will have a summary of the impacts.
And are any of these technologies already in use in certain countries? If so, which ones?
None of the technologies that we mentioned are in use at commercial level, and that is also an important issue because they are promising that they will have impact on climate change, and that will not happen. Even if these technologies will function, even if they will cause a lot of impacts, what happened now is that they are not even available. So the only technology that has been developed in any larger scale is carbon capture and storage. And this technology is, as it was mentioned by someone from the beginning, this is a technology invented by the oil industry some 60 years ago to recuperate deep reserves of oil. And that means to produce more oil. That is, so today, the majority of carbon capture and storage facilities are to produce more oil, and that means produce more climate change. So no, they are not in place, and that's why we still can stop them. And it's so important to not go this path of these really risky technologies because we have a lot of other alternatives. The first alternative for climate change is to reduce fossil fuels in any use of fossil fuels. That is the real measure we need to take. The second one is that there are a lot of alternatives at local level, at regional level, a diversity of alternatives for managing ecosystems, and really have alternatives in food and agriculture that prevent more climate change by not having so many chemicals and emission of gases and all that. So I could just say, as a kind of general summary, what we have today in this seminar, which is about marine geoengineering technologies, is that we have a set of unproven technologies that are very high risk and that they will not bring any solutions, but they will bring a lot of new risks. So that is why the first thing we have to do is to apply the precautionary principle. And the Convention on Biological Diversity has to take this as one of the main issues to discuss next week in relation to marine biodiversity.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm sorry that not all of the questions got answered, but we are at time. So I just want to mention a few concluding statements. First of all, thank you everybody for being here in this webinar. And I would like to thank all of our speakers for their insightful contributions and everyone in the audience for your active participation. And I would also especially like to extend my thanks to all the translators and interpreters that were here to help. Thank you. And we will be sending up a follow-up email to all the participants that will include the slides, a recording of today's session, and any additional materials that were shared. Please be on a lookout for this in your inbox. And I'm also excited to share that the Home Alliance will soon be releasing a statement regarding the spread of outdoor geoengineering. This important update will also be included in the same email. So please look out for that. In closing, I am struck by the enthusiasm and commitment displayed today. I know despite the growing numbers of geoengineering proposals, many of us that have joined this webinar are here because we deeply care about protecting our oceans. So it gives me hope to know that while some look to the oceans for solutions, there are many of us who are passionate about safeguarding it. So thank you once again for being here. And yeah, thank you.